Now, we were talking about churches earlier. You brought that up. So
Yes.
I wanted to mention this, okay? Because this was something that was making big news. And it says, this is from a Fox News article. And it says, California announces churches, houses of worship can reopen under certain guidelines amid coronavirus outbreak. Now, of course, this is a result of Trump's threat against the states, saying that if you do not open churches, I will. And a lot of people, especially a lot of people actually on the Liberty side, were upset by that comment that Trump made, because there's this idea that I don't understand, that it's okay for you to be oppressed as long as it's your state that oppresses you and not the federal government. That's the problem that I really have with a lot of the quote unquote liberty side of this argument. Also, it's a never Trumper thing. Anything Trump says is wrong. Anything Trump says is wrong. So it's a never Trumper thing. And I'm kind of sick of it. As you know, anybody who views this, they know I am an advocate of the 14th Amendment. I am also an advocate of the 10th Amendment. I'm an advocate of both, but I am an advocate ultimately of those being used, both of those amendments being used to protect your freedoms. That is the entire intention of the 10th Amendment. That's the entire intention of the 14th Amendment. Is there is a balancing act where sometimes, yes, the federal government is the oppressor, but there are also times that your local government is the oppressor. Jim Crow, obviously, is a great example of this. This is one of the biggest reasons that we have the Civil Rights Act, whether you agree with all of it or not. But it was done to enact, the 14th Amendment, because we had these egregious violations where states were violating people's rights. And the same thing has been happening all over the country, where governors have sidestepped the Constitution and they have closed down churches of worship under pain of arrest. And by the way, pain of arrest can mean pain of death. Okay, that's the truth of it. Anytime you make a law and you decide that you can arrest somebody for it, or even fine somebody for it, that means that you are allowing someone, usually a police officer, to stop this person forcibly and either issue the citation or arrest them. And when that person says no, bad things happen. I know this because I have 20 years of experience doing this. So it really upsets me when we get this sort of idea that it's okay for your local government to oppress you. I just don't understand it. And it's all in the name of, well, we don't want Trump involved because we don't like Trump. I think this is great that that the president did say that he would step in. I think it's great, actually, that the governor of California, Newsom, has decided to at least put some compliance into this and put out some rules so that churches can open. But I also want to point out, in Arizona, we never closed the churches. They closed on their own. Governor Ducey's order did not include churches, and it never should have, because that is unconstitutional. There is nothing in the Constitution that I can see that says you are allowed to suspend the Bill of Rights under any circumstances absent martial law. And the way martial law works in a legal sense is you suspend habeas corpus. And when that happens, of course, the whole thing is basically trashed. So we haven't had that, thankfully, because, again, President Trump didn't allow it, even though he was called to put military in the streets and do all those kinds of things. He didn't do it. So, again, I'll leave it at this, and Pete, you can say I want you to chime in as well. But my thought is,
I will.
just remember, a broken clock is always right at least twice a day. So be careful with not you specifically, but I think in liberty in general, people have to be careful with the never Trump and Trump is always wrong and all that kind of stuff, because he has been very right when it comes to not implementing martial law, not suspending habeas corpus, not putting the military on the street, and also in this case for advocating for churches to be able to open up, because that's what the Constitution says. And the Constitution overrides every single one of these state governors.
Yeah, you've had a lot of these governors have way overstepped their bounds. I would say a little bit of nuance here. If, again, the classic example is if the Japanese, like during World War II, were off of our Pacific coast, and you have a right to have lights on and have people over to your house and congregate and whatever. But during the blackouts, you had to turn off your lights. And that's, you know, in emergency circumstances, I can understand orders like that. But this was done very haphazardly. There's no due process, there's no statute of limitations. Look, if they can do this just arbitrarily, one person, they don't have to get a warrant, there's no process to say what are the limits, what's the time frame, then this is just tyranny, because they could do it for 6 months or they could do it for a year. And if they could do it for COVID, they could do it for the flu. If there is, you know, when you are endangering your neighbors, as in the case of the Japanese off the coast, then there's a case for more restrictions, because those are your rights. My right to swing my arms around ends at the tip of your nose. But here, there's no demonstrated danger from going to church. It's, yeah, you could spread the virus, but where does it stop? I mean, you've mentioned before that reporters have asked, "Are you going to shut down grocery stores?" Well, you can't do that, right? So at the end of the day, it's a cost benefit analysis.
And I do want to put
And
some context into this, because part of the reason that basically the Justice Department stepped in and told California that their policy was discriminatory was because they were allowing retail stores to open up, but they were not allowing churches to open up. And that was
right,
clearly discrimination, clearly discrimination.
yeah, and yes, it's discrimination. It's arbitrary. They're making rules without really thinking. So if you can open up a retail store, which isn't essential, well, that means that you can open up that church, but you're choosing not to. And so,
And again,
you know, this
and
is
I would advocate that churches are essential because churches are
Mhm.
protected under the Bill of Rights.
Yes,
Why didn't we shut down the free press, Pete? Why didn't we shut the free press down? Because the First Amendment says you can't. Because it
that's a
says you
very good
can't.
point. Yeah, yeah. Churches are given a special level of protection because of, you know, the way that this could be used to, for example, shut down religious minorities. We heard Bill de Blasio make those very weird comments about the Hasidic community, that they were going to padlock the synagogues and never allow them to open again. Well, there we know. I mean, that's a blinking red light. Obviously, that is way over the line. And if he were to do that, that would be a blatant constitutional violation.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I'm just glad that that the Justice Department did step in, and that the state is actually issuing some guidelines. I don't necessarily agree with the guidelines. I'm not going to go over them here, but at least they're doing something. At least it's liberty moving in the right direction, and that's one thing that I'm always about, because I always think the other side uses incrementalism all the time. Our side needs to use incrementalism as well, and has to realize that sometimes you can't push back all the way. You push back a little bit, and you keep pushing, and you keep pushing, and eventually you get to where you want to be.
And I would say we've given our governors and our mayors a lot of leeway up to this point, because our thinking was, okay, this is an emergency. We're going to take some time, figure out how deadly this virus is, how it's spread, those sorts of important questions that would actually tell us what is the scope of this emergency? What are the necessary precautions? What is dangerous, and what can we do without endangering other people?
The
But
entire
but
definition of an emergency is that it's temporary. So
right,
it's like these orders that these governors are using, these are meant to deal with things like forest fires or a hurricane or a tornado or something like that, where immediate action is needed. And you can't just call the legislature together and decide, hey, we're going to
right,
evacuate this town. The governor has to
right,
have that authority to do that. That's what these come
yes,
from. When it comes to a pandemic, you've had all this time to evaluate the situation and to mitigate. And you've brought this up. There's been all this time for legislatures to come in, and if they want to pass all sorts of crazy laws, they can, but they're not doing that. Instead, what they're
mm-mm,
doing is just giving up all of their authority to the local governor or the mayor and letting them decide everything. And that's the problem that
right,
I have is we're way beyond that point. At this point, the legislature should be stepping in. We could have a new health regulation, for instance, that says workers have to wear masks. The legislature has had plenty of time to do that in all 50 states. They could decide that and say, okay, we're going to make workers wear masks. They could do that. They could pass a law and say that. Instead,
right.
we have this, these executive orders that are deciding that. And we're way beyond that time period. This is not democracy. This is not a constitutional republic when one man or one woman is deciding these things. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. At least it's not how it's supposed to work.
Yeah. Not only is it illegal, unconstitutional, but this is gross incompetence that we're now several months into this crisis, and we have no real idea what the IFR, the infected fatality rate, is. How could we not know that? How could that not be the most important thing to figure out as soon as possible? But we have absolutely no idea. Or if we do, that number has not been released to the public.
There are
estimates out there.
Yeah, but I just want to point out that as far as that kind of thing goes, there are places you can look at that have done a much better job with testing, and you can get that number pretty close. And I'm talking about like South Korea. I've put up South Korea as a model of a country where they did implement widespread testing. They also do a lot of contact tracing, which of course is not popular among liberty advocates. They don't like the apps. They don't like that kind of stuff. But you know what? It's been very successful there. And so you have an example in South Korea of interventions that can be made where they didn't suspend liberty. They really didn't. You know, you gave up a little bit of your freedom when it comes to the contact tracing. And instead, you were still able to go worship. You were still able to go. They even had nightclubs open. I mean, they still had an intense amount of freedom that we were denied here in the United States. And then in contrast, you have the other side of the coin where Sweden, where they did essentially nothing. And you can look at those numbers as well. So I advocate people to do that. And you can kind of see how it works. The do nothing model, and you can also see the do something model without destroying all your freedoms. But they did have to give up some things. You know, they were using the apps and things like that. Although I think most of that was voluntary. Just a different culture where they were willing to do that. Japan's another interesting example of where they really didn't do a whole lot, and you can see the numbers are very different. So again, this situation is evolving, but if you want to find that information, we're getting indications now of how that looks. The German numbers are interesting too, because Germany also managed this crisis in an interesting way, different than a lot of other countries did, in terms of, yes, they had much better testing than many other countries did. And that's part of this equation that we often forget. The testing's getting there, and testing's become much more available. But without widespread testing, you still don't really know exactly what your problem, how the extent of your problem. That's the ultimate gauge of how big this thing really is.
Yeah. And Sweden is a more complicated case than we think it is, because while they didn't have a stay-at-home order, people have been taking precautions. People aren't stupid. And especially the Swedes, they're a very cohesive culture. It's a small country. It's kind of like living in a small town where you know everybody. Even their biggest cities are not very large compared to, say, New York City or LA. We don't always appreciate that here as Americans, that a large city in Europe isn't necessarily like a large city here in the US. So it's a very different thing. Even though they've had a higher rate of incidents than say Denmark or Norway, their curve kind of looks like the US. Things are going in the right direction. They've peaked, and the number of fatalities, thankfully, is going down. But it's not as simple as Sweden did absolutely nothing and it worked out for them. No,
that's all. But also, there's another side to that, Pete, which is unlike what you're seeing with people here, and we were just talking about the mask issue. A lot of that, I think, is quarantine fatigue. And quarantine fatigue doesn't exist in Sweden because they were still allowed to do things. They were still allowed to go to school. They were still allowed to go to the bar throughout this entire crisis. And therefore, there is no quarantine fatigue in Sweden because the only people quarantined in Sweden are people that are supposed to be quarantined, people that were sick. You don't quarantine healthy people. That's shelter in place, right? There was no shelter in place in Sweden. There were quarantines, but of sick people. That's a big difference too. So you don't have this quote unquote
it is a
quarantine fatigue effect that we have in the United States.
Right. So that tells you that maybe these shelter in place orders aren't necessary and aren't effective, whereas quarantining sick people we know is effective. All of the data from this pandemic and previous pandemics shows that it is and can be effective.
And I do want to put that out there, that because even I do it too, is there is a difference between a quarantine and shelter in place. And what we did was shelter in place. Everybody's been doing quarantines because everybody has been quarantining sick people pretty much across the board, universally in almost every country. But we have countries like Sweden that did not do the shelter in place.